I've been sitting on this story for years, mostly because saying it out loud makes it real in a way memory alone doesn't. This isn't a brag or a cautionary tale wrapped in fake humility. It's just something I did, and something that still follows me around like a shadow I can't quite step out of. For context, my name's William. I'm not a mastermind, not a movie villain, not even particularly brave. At the time this happened, I was broke in a quiet, humiliating way, the kind where you're still functional on the outside but constantly doing math in your head at the grocery store. I was working a forgettable job that put me in proximity to people with real power, the kind that wears tailored suits and talks about legacy, like it's a product you can buy. That's how I met him. An influential businessman, media presence, charitable foundation, the whole polished resume. From the outside, he looked untouchable. From a little closer, he looked terrified of one very specific thing getting out. I didn't go looking for dirt. That's the part one still cling to when I try to justify myself. The information fell into my lap through coincidence, loose lips, and my own habit of paying attention when people assume you don't matter. At first, it was just knowledge. Then it became leverage. And then it became a weight I couldn't ignore. I told myself it wasn't really about the money, though I needed it desperately. It was about control. About evening the scale between someone who could erase problems with a phone call and someone like me, who'd spent his life being erased. That was the moment the line blurred. Not when I made contact. Not when I asked for anything. But when I realized that the compromising information I had was worth more to him than any amount of cash I could ever earn honestly. And instead of walking away, I leaned into that realization. Everything that followed started right there. People always assume blackmail starts with snooping, hacking emails, tailing someone, digging through trash like a raccoon in an war film. That wasn't my entry point. Mine started with boredom and proximity. My job put me in conference rooms I wasn't meant to speak in. I was the guy refilling water pitchers, checking audio, nodding politely while pretending to be invisible. You'd be shocked what people say when they think you're just furniture. Executives gossip worse than teenagers. They name drop. They complain. They brag. And sometimes they confess, not to be absolved, but because they assume no one's listening. The first clue was a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. He'd stepped into the hallway, voice low but frantic, using phrases that didn't fit the public image I'd seen plastered on billboards. Words like settlement, private arrangement, don't put that in writing. I remember thinking it sounded like a man trying to hold the door shut while something heavy slammed against it from the other side. After that, patterns emerged. Sudden schedule changes. A personal assistant who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. A non-profit donation that felt less like charity and more like hush money. None of it was proof on its own. But together, it painted a picture I couldn't unsee. The real turning point came accidentally. I ran into someone at a bar, friend of a friend, loose tongue 3 drinks past discretion. They complained about being paid to forget something, laughed it off like a joke. When I asked a casual follow-up, they went quiet in a way that screamed mistake. They didn't name him. They didn't have to. The puzzle snapped into place. That was when the knowledge stopped being abstract. It wasn't rumor anymore. It was corroborated. Messy. Human. Dangerous. I went home that night and didn't sleep. I kept replaying every fragment in my head, weighing it like a coin between my fingers. I told myself I was just observing, just connecting dots. But some part of me already knew. I wasn't just holding information anymore. I was holding a loaded weapon. There's a moment before you do something wrong where you still have options, even if you pretend you don't. I remember mine clearly. It was a Tuesday night, rain tapping against my apartment windows like it was trying to get in, and I was sitting on the floor with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it. I wasn't writing a threat. Not yet. I told myself I was just organizing my thoughts. That's how it starts, reframing intention as preparation, preparation as curiosity. I listed what I knew, not what I would do. Names. Dates. Connections. Things that could be verified if someone wanted to dig. I kept the language clinical, detached, like I was documenting a case file for someone else. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that this wasn't some flimsy rumor. This was a fault line running right through the center of his life. And if it shifted, everything above it would collapse: board seats, partnerships, political friendships. Maybe even marriages. I felt sick thinking about it. I also felt powerful in a way that scared me. I spent hours arguing with myself. One version of me said, "This isn't your business." Another said, "It became your business the moment you learned it." I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone directly. I told myself he'd be fine. People like him always are. I told myself that if I didn't do it, someone else eventually would. The scariest part wasn't deciding whether to act. It was realizing how quickly my morals started to sound flexible when survival entered the conversation. Rent was overdue. My savings were gone. And here I was, holding a secret that could fix all of that with a single, carefully worded message. I didn't send anything that night. But I drafted it. Over and over. Each version softer than the last, like I was easing myself into the role instead of jumping straight in. By the time I shut the laptop, I knew something irreversible had already happened. I hadn't committed the crime yet. But I'd already crossed the line where I could pretend I wouldn't. I never sat down and said, "Okay, here's how I'm going to blackmail someone." That word still makes my stomach twist. Instead, I framed it as minimizing risk. Protecting myself. Being careful. Funny how ethics erode when you rename things. I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't be sloppy. Sloppy gets you exposed. Sloppy gets you sued, silenced, or worse, ignored. I watched how he moved through the world, how layers of people insulated him from inconvenience. Assistants filtered his calls. Lawyers filtered his problems. If I wanted to be heard, I had to bypass all of that without setting off alarms. I started by erasing footprints. Old social media posts gone. Accounts I didn't need anymore deleted. I stopped talking about my job to friends, stopped venting, stopped leaving traces of frustration that could later be framed as motive. It felt paranoid, but paranoia is just awareness when you're doing something you shouldn't. I also thought a lot about tone. That surprised me. Every instinct said to be threatening, to lean into fear. But fear makes people unpredictable. I didn't want him panicking. I wanted him calculating. Calm. Engaged. I practiced writing messages that sounded neutral, almost professional, like a business proposal no one asked for. What I didn't do, and this is important, was gather more dirt. I told myself that crossing that line would make me something else entirely. I worked only with what had already landed in my hands. Even then, I felt like I was building a house out of explosives and pretending the blueprints made it safe. By the end of that week, I had a single draft saved under a boring file name. No names. No accusations spelled out. Just enough detail to make it clear I wasn't guessing. I read it dozens of times, imagining how I'd feel if I received it. Each time, the answer was the same: trapped. That's when I knew the plan, if I could call it that, was ready. All that was left was to press send. I stared at the screen for a full hour before I sent it. No dramatic countdown. No shaking hands like in the movies. Just a dull pressure behind my eyes and a growing sense that time was moving without my permission. I didn't email him directly. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. Instead, I used a secure contact form tied to one of his private ventures, something obscure enough that it wouldn't get auto-deleted, but important enough that someone serious would read it. I kept the subject line boring. Regarding a sensitive matter. Nothing screams louder than trying not to scream. The message itself was short. Painfully so. I referenced specifics without naming them outright: dates, locations, a sequence of events only a handful of people could recognize. I made it clear I wasn't asking for anything yet. That was deliberate. I wanted the imbalance to sink in, for him to understand that the next move wasn't his. The hardest part was the closing line. I rewrote it at least 10 times before settling on something that sounded almost polite. If you wish to discuss how this information remains private, you know how to reach me. No threats. No ultimatums. Just an open door and the implication of what was waiting on the other side. When I finally clicked send, nothing happened. No lightning strike. No immediate regret. Just a quiet confirmation message and the sudden, terrifying realization that I couldn't unsend it. The waiting was worse than anything I'd imagined. Every buzz of my phone made my heart jump. Every unknown number felt like a trap. I started second-guessing everything, my wording, my assumptions, my sanity. What if I was wrong? What if he ignored it? What if he went straight to his lawyers and I just painted a target on my back? 3 days passed. Then 4. On the 5th day, I got a response. Not from him, but from someone who very clearly spoke for him. The message was brief, controlled, and terrifyingly calm. They acknowledged the situation without admitting to anything. They proposed a conversation. Offline. Private. I remember reading it and feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I'd been taken seriously. Dread because this was no longer theoretical. The game had started. Once there was a proposal for a conversation, everything sped up and slowed down at the same time. The reply didn't include threats, but it didn't need to. The subtext was enough: we see you. Now let's see how serious you are. They suggested a location: neutral, expensive, forgettable. One of those private dining rooms in a hotel where the walls are thick and the staff knows better than to remember faces. I didn't push back. Pushing back would have felt like posturing, and I was already out of my depth. The night before the meeting, I barely ate. I kept running scenarios through my head like bad simulations. What if this was a setup? What if I walked in and never walked out? I imagined headlines that would never mention my name, just tragic accident or unrelated incident. At the same time, a smaller, uglier part of me felt proud. I'd forced a man with real power to come to the table. I dressed carefully, not flashy, not sloppy. I wanted to look unremarkable. Someone you'd forget the moment you turned away. I left my phone at home and bought a cheap prepaid one on the way, which made me feel like a cliché and didn't stop my hands from sweating. When I arrived, he wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. Instead, it was the intermediary, the calm, well-dressed professional who radiated competence. They smiled like this was just another Tuesday, like people didn't ruin their lives in rooms like this. We talked around the issue at first. Polite. Vague. They tested me, asked questions designed to see how much I really knew. I answered carefully, revealing just enough to prove I wasn't bluffing. I could see the shift when it clicked for them, when they realized I wasn't some crank fishing for a payout. At one point, they asked me what I wanted. That question hit harder than I expected. I'd rehearsed answers, but saying it out loud made it real. I gave them a number. Not outrageous, not modest. Calculated. I justified it as compensation for my silence, my risk, my conscience. Like any of those things had a price tag that made sense. They didn't react. They just nodded, wrote something down, and said they'd be in touch. When I left, my legs felt weak. I kept expecting someone to stop me, to grab my arm, to say I'd gone too far. No one did. The lobby was full of normal people doing normal things, completely unaware that my life had just split into before and after. I realized then that the most dangerous part wasn't fear. It was how quickly this was starting to feel normal. The follow-up came faster than I expected. Less than 24 hours. That alone should have told me something about how badly they wanted this contained. The intermediary didn't waste words this time. They agreed to the number, with conditions. Strict ones. No future contact. No copies of anything, digital or otherwise. A clean break. They framed it like a courtesy, like they were doing me a favor by making this painless. I nodded through most of it, but inside my head alarms were screaming. People like this don't just hand over money and trust that silence sticks. Silence has to be enforced somehow. I asked what guarantees I had. The question earned me the first real look, cold, assessing, the kind you give something you're deciding whether to crush. They said, very calmly, that my guarantee was mutual self-interest. If I talked, the consequences wouldn't stop with me. They wouldn't need to threaten me directly. The fallout would do the work for them. Careers implode. Credibility evaporates. I'd be painted as a liar, an opportunist, a disgruntled nobody. And who would believe me over him? That was the moment the thrill curdled into something darker. I'd thought I was the one holding the leverage. Turns out leverage has an expiration date. We finalized logistics. Layered, anonymous, frustratingly complex. I won't pretend I understood all of it. That was by design. Plausible deniability wrapped in legal padding. The more distance between me and the money, the better it was for them. When the meeting ended, they gave me a look that stuck with me. Not angry. Not afraid. Just disappointed. Like I'd broken some unspoken rule about knowing my place. Walking out, I realized I wasn't negotiating with a man anymore. I was negotiating with a system. One that had been dealing with problems like me long before I ever existed. And suddenly, for the first time since this started, I wondered if I'd miscalculated, not in the details, but in assuming that walking away was ever really an option. The money arrived without ceremony. No dramatic notification, no moment where angels sang or my bank app glowed gold. It just appeared. Numbers on a screen, quietly rearranged, like they'd always belonged there. I stared at it for a long time. I kept refreshing, half expecting it to vanish or trigger some alarm. My heart was pounding, but not with joy. With suspicion. With the creeping realization that this was the most dangerous phase, the part where I was supposed to relax. I didn't touch it right away. I don't know why. Maybe I thought interacting with it would make it more real, or maybe I was subconsciously delaying the guilt. Instead, I went for a walk. Bad idea. Every passerby looked like they knew. Every black car slowed my pulse. I'd never felt so visible, while trying so hard to disappear. When I finally did use the money, it was for the most boring things imaginable. Rent. Debt. Groceries without mental math. Each purchase felt like a tiny confession. This is what you did it for. Not yachts. Not status. Just relief. That somehow made it worse. The strangest part was how quickly the fear morphed into something like emptiness. I'd been running on adrenaline for weeks, maybe months. Planning, waiting, negotiating. Now there was nothing to do but live with it. No next move. No leverage. Just me and the silence I'd sold. I also noticed a shift in how I thought about myself. I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. Before, I could pretend I was the kind of person who could do something like that but wouldn't. Now I knew better. I'd tested myself and gotten a very clear answer. A few nights later, I had my first real panic attack. No trigger. No warning. Just my body finally catching up to what my mind had been suppressing. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor, trying to breathe, thinking, this is the price they don't tell you about. The money solved my problems, sure. But it also stripped away the illusion that I was still innocent. I thought the deal was done. That was the agreement, after all, clean break, mutual silence, everyone goes back to pretending. For a few weeks, that's exactly how it felt. No messages. No weird knocks. No shadows stretching too long behind me. Then something small happened. Something stupid. An old coworker reached out. We hadn't spoken in years, but they'd seen a post, nothing related, just me mentioning I'd left my job and was taking time to reset. They joked about how lucky I was to get out when I did. Then they said, almost as an afterthought, things have been tense up top lately. My stomach dropped. I played it cool, asked what they meant. They didn't know much, just rumors. Legal scrambling. a board member stepping down quietly. The businessman's name never came up directly, but it didn't have to. I could feel the ripple effects of what I'd done, spreading outward in ways I couldn't predict or control. That's when it hit me. I'd been so focused on my silence that I hadn't considered how many other people were still talking. Secrets don't disappear just because you get paid. They compress. They mutate. They find new exits. Paranoia came roaring back, worse than before. Every headline felt like it was circling the truth. Every unknown email made my pulse spike. I started replaying the meetings in my head, wondering if I'd missed something, some clause, some look, some implied threat I'd brushed off. I even drafted messages I never sent. Apologies. Explanations. Preemptive defenses. All of them ended up deleted, because contacting anyone connected to that world again felt like tapping on glass that was already cracked. What scared me most was the realization that I no longer had any control. When I had the information, I at least had leverage. Now I just had money and a promise, and promises are fragile things when power gets nervous. I'd thought the crime ended when the money arrived. Turns out, that was just the part where I stopped being an active player and became collateral. Time didn't fix anything. It just dulled the sharpest edges and left the rest to fester. I started living smaller without meaning to. Fewer friends. Fewer opinions. I stopped posting online entirely, like erasing myself might make me harder to remember. I avoided places where influential people gathered, even casually. I wasn't hiding from anyone specific, I was hiding from the possibility of recognition, from the idea that someone might connect me to a moment they were trying very hard to forget. Sleep became unreliable. Some nights I slept too much, like I was trying to outrun my own thoughts. Other nights I lay awake replaying conversations, scanning them for hidden meanings that probably weren't there. I'd imagine a knock at the door and feel my chest tighten, then hate myself for still being afraid when, technically, I'd won. The guilt showed up in strange ways. Not as remorse for him, I'd lost that thread early on, but for the people orbiting the blast radius. Assistants, employees, partners who had no idea why things suddenly felt unstable. I'd told myself I was punching up. Some days I still believe that. Other days it feels like a convenient story I tell myself so I can get through breakfast. I also noticed something else, something quieter and more unsettling. I missed the intensity. The clarity. When everything was on the line, life felt sharp, purposeful. Now it felt like static. I hated that about myself, hated that I could even think that way, because it meant the crime had rewired something fundamental. I wasn't a villain in hiding. I wasn't a hero either. I was just a footnote in someone else's damage control strategy, trying to learn how to exist again without a secret burning a hole in my pocket. That's when I understood the real punishment. It wasn't fear of getting caught. It was having to live as the person who didn't. I came closer to being exposed after the fact than I ever did during the crime itself. That still messes with my head. It started with an article. Investigative piece, long form, the kind that drops on a Sunday and pretends it's just asking questions. I saw the headline while half asleep, phone inches from my face, and my heart slammed so hard I thought I was going to pass out. It wasn't explicit. No names in the title. But I recognized the shape of it immediately. Same timelines. Same institutions. Same carefully vague language. I read it 3 times, each pass slower than the last. My name wasn't there. None of the details I'd provided were quoted directly. But the implications were close enough that I felt exposed anyway, like someone had described my reflection without using my face. For a few days I was convinced someone would come knocking. Journalists. Lawyers. Anyone. I rehearsed answers in the shower, crafted denials I hoped I'd never need. I even considered skipping town, not dramatically, just quietly relocating somewhere I could blend in again. Nothing happened. The article caused a stir, though. I could tell by the reactions online, by the way people debated what must have happened behind closed doors. Watching strangers circle the truth without touching it was surreal. They were closer than they knew, and still impossibly far away. That's when it really sank in how insulated the powerful are. The story fizzled. A few reputations took surface-level hits. Then the news cycle moved on, hungry for something louder, messier, easier to digest. I was spared, not because I was clever, but because I was irrelevant. And that realization, being saved by my own smallness, felt like the final insult. After the almost exposure, I expected some kind of turning point. A lesson landing with a thud. Closure. Instead, things just kept going. That might be the most honest consequence of all. Life doesn't pause to let you process your worst decisions. I changed jobs. Moved apartments. On paper, it looked like progress. Inside, it felt more like shedding skins, trying to see if a different version of me might feel cleaner. It never really did. The crime followed me in subtler ways, how I assessed people, how quickly I looked for weaknesses without meaning to. I hated that instinct, but it was there now, like a muscle I'd accidentally trained. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of him on the news. Short clip. Panel discussion. Charity gala. Each time, my stomach tightened, waiting for something to crack. It never did. If anything, he looked more polished than before, like the ordeal had taught him how to armor up better. That realization stung more than I expected. I'd imagined my actions leaving a permanent mark. Turns out, I'd been a temporary inconvenience. The money was mostly gone by then. Not squandered, just absorbed by life the way all money eventually is. Bills, time, entropy. There was something poetic about that. I'd traded a piece of myself for a number that couldn't even stick around long enough to justify the trade. I tried therapy. Skirted around the truth. Talked about a bad decision and moral compromise in vague, bloodless terms. The therapist nodded, offered frameworks, but without the full story, it all felt like applying bandages to a wound I refused to uncover. Some nights, I wondered what would have happened if I'd walked away at the beginning. Not in a grand, cinematic sense, just quietly choosing not to press send. I don't know if I'd be happier. But I think I'd sleep differently. That's the thing no one tells you. Even when you get away with it, the choice keeps happening. Over and over. In memory. In habit. In who you become when no one's watching. I'm writing this now because time has done what it always does. It's taken the edge off the fear and left the questions behind. The kind you can't outrun by moving apartments or changing jobs. The kind that only get louder when everything else gets quiet. I've never told anyone the full story. Not friends. Not therapists. Not strangers at bars. This is the closest I've come, hiding behind anonymity like it's still doing me favors. Maybe that's cowardly. Maybe it's just realistic. Some truths don't need witnesses, they just need air. I've noticed something strange as I've typed this out. I'm not trying to justify myself anymore. Earlier versions of this story, ones I rehearsed in my head, were full of explanations. Poverty. Power imbalance. Survival. All true, maybe, but incomplete. The honest version is simpler and harder to swallow. I did it because I could, and because for once in my life, the risk felt like agency. That's an uncomfortable thing to admit, especially in a world that likes its villains obvious and its victims clean. I was neither. I was just a person who made a choice and then spent years learning what that choice cost in ways no transaction receipt could show. Posting this feels like a small rebellion against the silence I sold. Not enough to hurt anyone. Not enough to fix anything. Just enough to acknowledge that it happened, and that it shaped me. If you're reading this and wondering whether I'm afraid of consequences even now, the answer is yes. But it's a quieter fear. Less about punishment, more about recognition. About someone seeing themselves in this, and realizing how thin the line really is. I don't know if confession absolves anything. But I do know that carrying it alone stopped feeling like strength a long time ago. If I could talk to the version of myself sitting on that apartment floor with a legal pad and a rationalization, I don't think I'd try to scare him. Fear didn't stop me then, it just made me feel special for pushing through it. I'd probably say something quieter, something harder to argue with. I'd tell him that leverage is a lie. That it feels solid right up until the moment you use it, and then it dissolves, leaving you exposed in ways you didn't plan for. I'd tell him that power borrowed from someone else's shame doesn't belong to you, and it always wants to go home. I'd also say this to anyone reading who thinks they're on the edge of a similar decision: blackmail, extortion. Just one message. Whatever name you give it to make it palatable, you won't feel clever for long. You won't feel strong. You'll feel changed. Subtly at first, then permanently. You'll start scanning rooms for angles instead of exits. You'll start measuring people instead of knowing them. And maybe you'll get away with it. Statistically, plenty of people do. But getting away isn't the same as moving on. It's more like learning to walk with a limp you don't explain to anyone. I'm not pretending there was a clean, heroic alternative. Life doesn't offer those as often as we'd like. But there were versions of my future that didn't involve carrying this particular weight, and I didn't choose them because this one looked faster. That's the real warning, I guess. Shortcuts don't just skip steps, they skip parts of you too. I don't expect forgiveness. Not from you, not from myself. That isn't why I'm ending this here. Some stories don't resolve cleanly, they just run out of places to hide. Nothing dramatic ever happened after that. No courtroom. No midnight arrest. The businessman is still out there, still influential, still carefully managed. I'm still here too, older, quieter, more cautious in ways I never used to be. If you passed me on the street, you wouldn't see anything remarkable. That's kind of the point. What this changed most was my sense of identity. I used to think of myself as someone life happened to. Now I know I'm someone who can make things happen, for better or worse, and that knowledge is heavier than I expected. It comes with responsibility I didn't ask for but can't give back. I've learned to live with the contradiction. I regret what I did, and I understand why I did it. Both are true. Neither cancels the other out. Maybe that's as close to honesty as I'll ever get. If there's any advice buried in all this, it's simple and deeply unglamorous. Pause longer than feels comfortable before you cross a line. Sit with the choice until it loses its urgency. If it still feels right after that, at least you'll know you weren't rushed by desperation or adrenaline. As for me, this is where I leave the story. Not because it's over, but because it finally belongs to the past, and I'm trying, slowly, to let it stay there.